Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Governor of the State of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, escorted by Mrs. Edward Kennedy. Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce the Honorable Senator from Massachusetts, Edward M. Kennedy, accompanied by the former First Lady of the United States, Mrs. Ronald Reagan. For those of you who I have not met, I'm Duke Blackwood, the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Foundation. It is my honor and pleasure to welcome you all here today. Before we get started, I ask that you please turn off your cell phones and your pagers. Now, I would like for you to stand and join me in honoring our men and women who are serving abroad and here in the United States for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated. It is my distinct honor to welcome and introduce a couple of people. We have a late ad today, and it is my pleasure to once again recognize the Governor of the great state of California, Mr. Arnold Schwarzenegger. We also have another distinguished guest here tonight, the Secretary of the Interior, Mr. Dirk Kempthorne. Secretary. I'd also like to recognize our three trustees that are with us tonight, Mr. Jim Pattison, Mr. Merv Griffin, and Mr. Fred Ryan. And I think the Senator would like for us to introduce our local officials. We have a couple from the City of Thousand Oaks, Scott Mitnick and Tom Clancy. And finally, probably the most special introduction. It is always a thrill and excitement to, thank you for Merv, to honor to have the person who stood next to Ronald Reagan for more than 50 years. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Nancy Reagan. Now I'd like to welcome on stage the chairman of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library Foundation, Mr. Frederick J. Ryan.
Thank you, Duke, and good evening and welcome to the Reagan Presidential Library. On behalf of Mrs. Reagan and the trustees of the Reagan Library, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this very special occasion this evening. I would also like to express our appreciation to our distinguished governor, who is a frequent and always welcomed visitor of the library. Thank you for joining us again. And Secretary Kempthorne, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but he is maybe the only person, or at least a small handful, who have been a mayor, a governor, a senator, a United States senator, and a cabinet secretary. And we're hoping you might come back and join us again in the future, sir. Well, tonight we host a great leader of the loyal opposition. He shared many things with President Reagan, among them a great pride in their Irish heritage. They both loved the fact that over a dozen American presidents were of Irish origin. In fact, the rest of the presidents probably were too, but they didn't get around to tracing their roots. President Reagan made a habit of spending St. Patrick's Day with Senator Kennedy and Speaker Tip O'Neill. And late in his administration, the president told the story about how he was inspired by St. Patrick, because St. Patrick was a man of passion and strength of conviction, and that St. Patrick ultimately converted the people of Ireland from heathens to Christianity. Well, he was inspired by this example and attempted to make a political conversion of Senator Kennedy and Speaker O'Neill. But in the end, when it just didn't work out the way he hoped, he realized that St. Patrick had the easier assignment. President Reagan used to joke, quote, "Jesse Helms wants me to move to the right. Lowell Weicker wants me to move to the left. Ted Kennedy wants me to move back to California." We are delighted that Ted Kennedy has come out to California with his lovely wife, Vicki. And today we have the opportunity to recognize the senator for so many things, including his devoted support of the Reagan Library and his thoughtful friendship with Mrs. Reagan. But perhaps more than anything else, his presence here today reminds us that Ronald Reagan and Ted Kennedy knew how to be political adversaries without being personal enemies. And in a Washington tribute, Senator Kennedy described Ronald Reagan as, quote, "a good friend and a generous foe." He said President Reagan sought to defeat his opponents, not to destroy them. Well, since 1962, Ted Kennedy has served as United States Senator from Massachusetts, making him one of the most senior members of the Senate. That's in years of service, not in age. For decades, Senator Kennedy has fought hard for issues that benefit Massachusetts and the nation. He's been a bold leader in areas of health care, education, civil rights, the environment, and a champion of rights for individuals with disabilities. And I am pleased to introduce our generous foe and good friend, Senator Edward Kennedy.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much. Very, very nice. I think this is Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Fred, for that extremely kind and warm introduction, and most of all for the extraordinary dedication and talent that you and Duke Blackwood and this wonderful staff bring to the Reagan Library and Museum. I'd also like to thank my wife Vicki for making the flight out here with me this morning, join with all of you. And I'm glad to see my three favorite Republicans right in this room and right in front of me. More about Mrs. Reagan in just a few minutes. And the governor of our state, I don't have much of an opportunity to have him listen to me very often. So this is really something that I'm going to enjoy now for the next. Arnold, I thank you for coming and being here this evening, and a very special welcome to Dirk Kempthorne. We've served in the United States Senate together. We're on the Armed Services Committee, and I admired him and respected him for the service in the Senate. Then he left, as Fred has pointed out, went back and was a governor of his state, and a courageous governor of his state. And then when the president called, President Bush, to be in charge of the Interior Department, he didn't have to look far, and Dirk Kempthorne responded, a real public servant, day in and day out. Dirk, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm grateful that my nephew, Chris Lawford, and his wife, Lana, are here as well. I thank... when I was on my way in here just a few moments ago, someone came up and got a hold of me, grabbed me, and said, has anyone ever told you that you look like Ted Kennedy? And I said, yes, they have. And they said, must make you mad as hell, doesn't it? I was down the other day in Virginia, a rather conservative part of the state of Virginia, and I was just about to get up to speak. They were introducing me, and just during the introduction, someone in the audience says, and furthermore, Kennedy's a horse's tail, or something like that, And what do you know, some of the people there at the chamber came up and grabbed this person and threw him out of the room. And I said to the chair, I said, I didn't know that this was Kennedy country. And he replied, it isn't, it's horse country. And in any event, I want to offer a special thanks to Mrs. Reagan, who so graciously invited Vicki and me to join you this evening. Time and time again, Mrs. Reagan has touched the nation's heart. She has inspired us with her dignity and compassion and joy, and she's shown true commitment and strength in times of great difficulty. Nancy Reagan is a national treasure, and she continues to make a difference for America and the world. And the day will come when millions of families, counting on the promise of medical miracles from research on stem cells, will thank Nancy Reagan for all she did on their behalf. So thank you, Mrs. Reagan, for everything, and for asking us to share this beautiful evening here with you in Simi Valley. I understand an important month is coming up for the library as you prepare to host the first Republican presidential debates of 2008 campaign, and later, your first annual Mother's Day brunch. As for the first event, I'm afraid I wish you, or at least the Republican candidates, only moderate success. But I assure you that all the Kennedys are with you 100% on the importance of Mother's Day. I have so many wonderful memories of President Reagan, a president great in purpose, who has a high place on the mountaintop of history. I recall not just the accomplishments, but the kind of man he was. He was always a good friend and a gracious foe. And I came to understand the generosity of the man just months into his presidency when he brought the Kennedy family to the White House to present Ethel with the Congressional Gold Medal for my brother Bob. It was an early and powerful demonstration of the largeness of spirit that infused his presidency and his life. And it was a day none of us in our family will ever forget. A few months later, my mother came to the White House to thank President and Mrs. Reagan personally, and they were especially gracious. Mother gave him some of Jack's letters about football and Notre Dame. She knew President Reagan's background, and he made a point of showing her that he was still using the same White House desk that Jack had used as president. Mother then mentioned that she had first visited the White House as a young girl in the 1890s when William McKinley was president. President Reagan didn't miss a beat. He said, "Mrs. Kennedy, when I ran against Pat Brown, he claimed I had the same platform as William McKinley." I started to laugh, and immediately he said, "Don't laugh, Senator. McKinley freed Cuba." That's the kind of man he was. A strong competitor who wanted to win, not just for himself, but for his beliefs. He wanted to defeat his opponents, but not destroy them. Our battles on the issues might resume the next morning, but we could laugh together at the end of the day. And whatever our differences, we were all united by our love of country and its ideals. I believe he will always retain the essence of the idealism that inspired him long before he ran for office. In 1947, he joined Americans for Democratic Action soon after its creation. James Loeb, a union leader and one of its founders, wrote him a letter. "Dear Ronnie, it was an encouraging experience to have had a chance to talk to you and to know there are people in your position who share so completely a liberal point of view." His point of view may have changed, but his idealism never did. And neither did his vision of hope that enabled this landmark conservative ultimately to transcend the political categories and stand quintessentially American. In June of 1985, in another act of generosity, President and Mrs. Reagan came to my home outside of Washington for a dinner to support the new Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston. In his remarks that evening, he made a beautiful observation about my brother, which captured Jack's spirit perfectly. He said, "Jack seemed to grasp from the beginning that life is one fast-moving train, and that you have to jump aboard and hold on to your hat and relish the sweep of the wind as it rushes by. You have to enjoy the journey. It's unthankful not to." Those words apply to President Ronald Reagan himself. At an age when many were slowing down, he jumped aboard the fastest train of all. Not as a passenger, content to watch the scenery, but as the engineer determined to lead the country on a journey to the shining city on a hill that was a touchstone for him as well as for President Kennedy. In the 1980s, I was on that train too. It was a great ride. And much of the time, it's fair to say, I was doing what I could to steer it in a different direction. We disagreed on many things, but we agreed the United States is a beacon of light for people across the earth. What we had in common was far greater than what divided us. It was the idea of America. For most of us born and raised here, it's sometimes hard to grasp what the idea of America has meant to the billions of people who have looked at us from afar throughout our history. But President Reagan and President Kennedy understood it, honored it, enriched, and advanced it. They recognized that America's commitment to liberty and opportunity and the rule of law is still a revolutionary idea. They each had faith that America's best days lie ahead, and that our true power in the world depends on our fealty to our country's founding ideals. Today, we need to recapture the spirit that these two leaders personified if we are to make this new century the next American century. We live in challenging and perilous times, but that fact is hardly new in the American experiment. Every fall semester, John Lewis Gaddis, one of the foremost historians, teaches the Cold War to undergraduates at Yale, few of whom have any memory of the days he describes. He writes, "When I talk about Stalin and Truman, even Reagan and Gorbachev, it could as easily be Napoleon, Caesar, Alexander the Great. To these students, the Cold War at first seems distant and quaint. They wonder," says Gaddis, "how we could have had anything to fear from a power that turned out to be as weak, as bumbling, as temporary as the Soviet Union. But the more they learn about those perilous years, the more they wonder, how did we ever make it out of the Cold War alive?" The challenge then was enormous. After we defeated fascism in the Second World War, we were faced with a Europe in which tens of millions were close to economic and social despair. The rise of the Soviet Union and the dawn of the nuclear age required a new definition of national security, one that for the first time in history had to deal with a potential threat to human existence itself. We had to meet the threat with both resolve and wisdom. We had to build what President Kennedy called in his inaugural address a grand and global alliance for freedom. We had to be strong across decades, abroad and at home. And we began with the Marshall Plan and NATO. And we committed our resources to the regeneration of Germany and Japan, now among the world's most vigorous democracies. And because we knew from the start that it would take more than armed force and economic aid to preserve peace and defend liberty, we adopted the GI Bill of Rights to educate the veterans returning from the front lines of war. And those GIs became the new front lines of unparalleled prosperity. And we established academic exchange programs so that young scholars from around the world could study at American universities. And we built libraries and cultural centers in countries where information had been tightly controlled. We translated the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the works of America's greatest authors into dozens of languages and sent them everywhere as compelling ambassadors of the idea of America. We broadcast America's story to audience wherever freedom was endangered or denied. In that same spirit, President Kennedy created the Peace Corps, calling on America's youth to sacrifice their energies and time and toil in the cause of world peace and human progress. We were a nation blessed with human and financial resources we could send across the globe to help shape a more hopeful future, and we did. And nearly 190,000 Americans have served in the Peace Corps. And today, almost 8,000 volunteers serve in 67 countries, including many on the other side of what was once the Iron Curtain. Each of them is America at its best, making better the life of the world. And as the arms race mounted, so did our unprecedented effort to inspire others to embrace our values of peace and democracy and fundamental human dignity. Here at home, we work to help our nation to live up to its principles for every American, and we breathe new life into the idea and the ideal of America. We outlawed racial segregation, guaranteed equal access to public facilities and the right to vote, prohibited job discrimination because of age and race or gender, opened the door to higher education for women, multiplied the middle class, acted, however imperfectly, to combat the poverty of the other America, and brought decent health care to tens of millions of senior citizens with the passage of Medicare. America lifted itself up at home as it served and saved the cause of liberty in the world. The Cold War ended with the utter collapse of the Soviet Union. It had been waged as a bipartisan enterprise by Republican and Democrat Congresses and administrations from the first moment to the last. There were disagreements over tactics, to be sure, but unanimity in our resolve to contain and defeat democracy's great enemy was there. And President Ronald Reagan deserves immense credit for the success we finally achieved. the greatest victory for liberty against the greatest threat of tyranny. President Reagan foresaw it, called for it, and Mr. Gorbachev did tear down that wall. In his farewell address to the nation in January 1989, President Reagan described not only the end of the Cold War, but another of the singular triumphs of his presidency, the recovery of American morale. I believe he was right when he said, America is respected again in the world and looked to for leadership. Other nations understood that the best guarantee of peace and stability would be for the United States to live up to its ideals as a beacon for the rest of the planet. We were admired for our democracy and respected for our economic strength. Today, the situation is very different from the world President Reagan left us. We are sadly diminished, even in the eyes of our friends. Anti-Americanism is on the rise. We seem to have lost our way, our vision, our confidence, and in the future. Others have stopped listening to us the way they once did. We have strained the extraordinary alliances that advanced our ideals as well as our interests. At the root of much of the anti-Americanism that has surfaced in recent years is the perception of American unilateralism in international affairs. I am astonished when some say it does not matter that so many in the world no longer respect the United States. Of course it matters. It matters to our security, and it has mattered since the first days of our republic. In the opening paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson acknowledged the importance of a decent respect for the opinions of mankind. That quality is as true today as it was when our founders signed the Declaration, affirming it on that first 4th of July. To restore America's standing and strength, we must recapture the combination of realism and idealism, which motivated John Kennedy and Ronald Reagan to jump aboard that fast-moving train. We need to understand that the great challenges facing our fragile world require an abundance of hope that only a united and determined America can provide. America has to lead, and America has to inspire. The new sense of insecurity after 9/11 has led some to say all we need is to build a bristling fortress with higher walls and shut ourselves off from the world to keep the dangers out. But in an era where the oceans no longer protect us, that approach will not provide true security. We must recall and believe President Reagan's famous words in Berlin. Democracy builds bridges between people. It tears down walls. In Iraq, we've acted nearly alone, and we're paying a terrible price. Yet earlier this month, tens of thousands of Iraqis marched against us, demanding an end to what they denounced as an American occupation. I oppose the war in Iraq, and I've called for setting a course to end it, precisely because this war profoundly weakens America. Ending it is essential to our security and to regaining the respect of the world. We have learned again, as President Reagan told us, that might alone cannot make America right. We cannot prescribe our own rules for the modern world. If we try to do so by force, we deprive our great nation of the moral claim that is the ground of our being and the purpose of our power. We can and sometimes must defend democracy by force, but we cannot impose it by force. Democratic principles are universal, but democracy must find its champions within each country's culture and traditions. We need to seek common ground with our friends and renew the alliances that keep the world safe for human rights and human survival when the threat of nuclear war was a clear and present danger. We will always defend our interests, but we put them at grave risk when we choose to act unilaterally in an independent era. The unconventional warfare used by our enemies mocks any conventional war strategy that we stubbornly pursue on our own. We live in a time of enormous possibility and enormous risk, and no nation is guaranteed a limitless future of prosperity or security. We have to work for it, and we have to sacrifice for it. Presidents from Truman to Reagan defended our liberty and our security in concert with our allies, with a clear-eyed appraisal of our interests and our capacities, and with a sense of overriding principle, and they prevailed. They understood as well that strength is not just something we exercise overseas, but something we must build here at home. And they understood that our greatest national strength is found in our people. Building our strength here at home means providing education that will empower our people with skills they need to compete in the global economy. Technology has liberated highly educated workers in other lands to engage actively in the international economy. We must meet that challenge. We must strengthen our nation by meeting the urgent challenge presented by illegal immigration. The world is watching to see how we respond, whether we can achieve a forward-looking reform that enriches our nation with the dedicated talent of new Americans, or whether we succumb to fear and recrimination. There is much common ground on the issue in Congress, especially on the needs to strengthen our borders and enforce our laws. What we need now is a good faith effort to reach a larger compromise that honors our commitment to our security, to our families, and to the ideals upon which America was founded. President Bush supports that kind of comprehensive solution. So do I, and I'm sure President Reagan would too. Every generation of Americans has been strengthened by the spirit of hardworking immigrants from many parts of the globe. As President Reagan said so eloquently in one of his last speeches, we lead the world because, unique among nations, we draw our people, our strength, from every country and every corner of the world. And by doing so, we continuously renew and enrich our nation. He continued, thanks to each wave of new arrivals to this land of opportunity, we're a nation forever young, forever bursting with energy and new ideas, and always on the cutting edge, always leading the world to the next frontier. This quality is vital to our future as a nation. If we ever close the door to new Americans, our leadership in the world would soon be lost. President Reagan's words ring true today, not just because he understood the issue of immigration, but because he understood the idea of America. From defeating terrorism to competing in the new global economy, to meeting the test of immigration, to safeguarding liberty at home as we defend it abroad, that idea can and must be our everlasting touchstone. We have the example our forebears set and the enduring ideals that guided them. We have the might, if we use it right, the economic ability, the military strength, and the power of principle to make the world, as President Reagan once put it, new again. His leadership was right for America and the world. So was John Kennedy's. But above all, I believe, with both of them, that America's best days are still to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. He has graciously accepted to take a few questions that we've had outside, so I'm going to go over and sit with him, and he's going to answer some questions.
I might tell you a little story before getting to the first question. And it was 1959, and I went out on behalf of my brother to the state of Montana to speak to Democrats that were going to send delegates to the Democratic Convention. And I spoke to this group, and some people in there said, well, there's some farmers down the road, and they're going to send delegates, so you better go down and talk to them. So I said, well, okay, I'll go down. And I always noticed my brother would always say at the end of his talk he'd answer any questions, so I thought, well, I'll try the same thing. So I finished making my little talk, and a hand went up in the back of the room and said, how does your brother stand on 90% of parity for wheat on controlled acreage? And I had no idea. And I've been in the Senate 44 years. I'll ask Dirk Kempthorne what I ought to do. I had absolutely no idea. But I remembered a story that happened to my brother. And before he went to the Pacific in PT boats, he was in naval intelligence, and he went to a factory in South Carolina, and he was talking to these workers about the dangers of sabotage in the factory. And he was explaining to them, if they saw a fire in the factory, they ought to determine the origin of the fire in order how to extinguish it. If the fire was made from wood, put water on it. But never put water on an oil and gas fire or an electric fire, because it spread in disastrous results. So he finished with his speech, talk, and he said, are there any questions? A hand went up in the back of the factory and said, now, Ensign Kennedy, if we look in the back of the factory and we see a fire back there, how are we going to know, just by looking at it, whether it's made from wood, oil and gas, or electricity, so we'll know exactly what to put on it and what not to put on it? And my brother thought about that for a while and said, you know, that's a very good question. There'll be someone here next week who'll talk on that very subject. So I'll keep my fingers crossed anyway. Good.
All right. Senator, we'll start out with an easy one.
There we go.
About that acreage, no. How are presidential libraries important to our nature, or our nation?
Well, all one has to do is come and visit this magnificent library and inhale the climate and the atmosphere and the stillness and gather the inspiration about this extraordinary president. And I think what those that really, both Mrs. Reagan and President Reagan, in selecting this site here and the way that this has all been developed, they want this institution not just to be the collection of important materials that are so essential for the future of our history, but to be a place that can inspire individuals to be interested in understanding the role of the presidency in the life of the American people. And it's extraordinary. If you look at where the presidential libraries are, you couldn't have really a perfect kind of a match. I mean, if you look from the west to the east, you have President Reagan's library here, you have President Nixon's library out in the west. As you go further down the southwest, you have President Johnson's, President Hoover, and Truman in Iowa and Missouri, and President Ford in the Midwest in Michigan. And then as you go further east, you have President Kennedy's in New England, in Boston. I mean, it's a rather interesting and wholly accidental fact that these presidential libraries are generally available and accessible to great numbers of American people in their communities. And we hope for the President Kennedy's library that it be the source of inspiration for future generations. I think that's what you feel here at President Reagan's library, and I think that's enormously important in terms of our democracy, our democratic institutions, and our ability to maintain the form of government that our founding fathers gave to us.
Thank you. All right, let's go to the tough stuff. What are the chances of the Democrats and Republicans coming to an agreement on what should happen in Iraq?
Well, It's a, I think it's really probably a matter of time. I mentioned in the talk I was voted against going. I'm on the Armed Services Committee, and I listened as a member of the Armed Services Committee to General Hoare, who lives out here now in San Diego, was the Marine, highly decorated, 3 or 4 silver stars for personal gallantry in Vietnam. I listened to General Nash, who commanded the American forces in Iraq I. I listened to Wes Clark, who at that time was long before he was a candidate. He was very gifted, talented. He'd been in the defense policy. I listened to General Zinni, who was a highly, highly decorated Marine. And I always remember what General Hoare told me, and he said, Senator, if we go into Baghdad, it'll make the last 5 minutes of Baghdad will be just like the last 5 minutes of Private Ryan. And I always remember those words. I came out, and then we went to a classified briefing, which Don Rumsfeld and George Tenet were at, and Carl Levin asked the Secretary of Defense then, where do you believe these weapons of mass destruction are? And he said, well, they're northeast, south, and west of Baghdad. So we thought there was about anywhere from 125 to 150 locations that they would be. So Carl Levin said, well, if we got all those, why don't we tell the inspectors where they are, our best intelligence, so that we can find out where they are. And well, we can't do that because if we tell them that inspection system is all infiltrated by Saddam and they'll move them. Well, so Levin said, well, can't we find out? If say you're going to 10, we're going to tell them 10, can't we watch those 10? Well, we'll see what we can do. But the fact remains they were never given, and they never had those parts. So I was leery from the... Now, there's a wonderful Muslim scholar at Princeton, Bernard Lewis, and he has said something that is a simple sentence and very profound, and something that is difficult for us to understand. He said, Americans have to understand Iraqis don't want America to win, but they don't want America to lose. And translated, it means that if we just rely on a military solution, they're not going to let us win. But if we do have other interests, which we do in that country, we clearly do in that region, and we try and find out if we do have some common interests. Iran, for instance, on its border with Iraq wants stability. Well, we want stability. Well, has anybody thought, well, we've got some interest in trying to find out if Iran wants stability in there, and they don't want 100,000 refugees pouring into their country, overloading all of their systems, their school, and disrupting the country. Either do the Syrians on this. Do they want to have the overrun? Jordan has closed down its borders. It's got 750,000 refugees, which is 10% of its total population. It'd be the equivalent of 40 million people coming in here in a period of about a month. These countries, it's going to be enormously destabilizing this. And I think that's what the commission understood, the Baker-Hamilton Commission understood, and that is to try and see if we can't have an opportunity to see if we can't find ways of finding American interests and see if we can't find a way to deal with this. And I think that's what we're very, very, very hopeful. I think what the unfortunate part now is that everybody sort of in there, gets locked in these positions on this. What if they just said, what if the president said, look, will Congress just not make speeches or do anything for 60 days, and I'll send Baker, if he'll go back over, I'll send President Clinton, I'll send 1 or 2 people over there and try for 60 days and see what we can do, besides doing troops. What about a surge and diplomatic kind of thing? Challenge America. Do you think we could try and do something on it? So I think the president gets a lot of advice from different, and hopefully all of us know how important it is to try and deal with this issue, and hopefully we'll be able to.
So is there anything in specific that can happen to bring the two together?
Well, I think if you're not going to have that kind of effort, then the question you have to ask, I'll tell you, and it's getting longer, I'm going to shorten this part of it, but in the Armed Services Committee last fall, just in August, just at the end of July, we had General Abizaid and General Casey, and one of the issues then are we going to reintroduce troops? Are we going to have a surge? And General Abizaid and General Casey, one of them was the commander in Iraq, and the other is the commander in the region. Both of them testified. Abu Zaid speaks Arabic. He's lived in that region for 4 years. Highly regarded and respected as a military figure. And they said in the testimony before the Armed Services Committee, we have tried 4 surges. They tried it after the battles of Fallujah, after the temple was blown up, and they had tried just at the times after the elections. They had tried 4 surges, and they all got overwhelmed. And at that time, they told us, the Armed Services Committee, that they were not going to make a recommendation that we're going to go in that direction. Now we come back in January. The president takes 82 days, and then he makes a judgment that we're going to go, and they replace all the military personnel. So at least we should have had an opportunity to debate nationwide whether the president taking the time for a different policy, whether we were going to surge or not surge. But what happened was the president extended the terms, for example, the Marines, from 12 or 14 months to 18 months. So he got a big chunk of military personnel already over there. So effectively the surge had started. Now you're in the position that if you interrupt it or try and stop it, it's in the middle of this is in the middle of a military operation of it, and people will question it. The United States Congress has the power and the authority of the purse. And in 2000, I was against the war. 2005, I indicated that I thought we ought to start the withdrawal, because I think this Army, listen to this, this Army, this military, we're the best military in the world. There was no question about it. We defeated this country 10 years ago. No question about it. This is a third-rate country in terms of its military expenditures. It's 25 million people. That's a size, it's a little larger than New England, let alone California. And we have had American troops that are the best troops in the world have been there longer than all of World War II. They've been there longer than the Korean War. And many of us believe that the military have done everything we've asked them to do, but they are in the middle of this crossfire. And I think we're asking them to take to try and perform a function, basically, which they weren't trained for in terms of the unconventional warfare. And in a country, their defense budget was $4 billion. Ours is $450 a year, $670 billion now. It's $2.5 billion a month now on this. And our military is still pinned down at some time. It's 3 to 5% of our al-Qaeda. You got more, obviously. Best estimate is anywhere from 12 to 3,000. That's a chunk of people over there that are bad. But the idea that the al-Qaeda, I mean, that the Sunnis and the Shia are going to come, if they lose over there, and are going to come to Boston. I heard the same in the Contra War. If we didn't support the Contra War, everybody was coming to Harlingen in Texas and take that over. My God, they stopped the funding of it. And there's a lot of poverty in those, and some issues and stability in some of the regions, but this isn't where it's at. Final point I make, I was talking to Gordon Brown, who will be the next prime minister in England. He said the largest expansion of al-Qaeda cells is in Africa. This is what Gordon Brown told me under his intelligence report. You have 1 million Africans every year that aren't going to school. It costs $100 to educate an African in Africa, of the 100 million. $12 billion. He said, why doesn't the United States take $4 billion? 2 weeks of the battle in Iraq. We'll take $4 billion, and we'll get the Asians to take $4 billion and effectively undermine the whole. He said, why aren't we get the United States, which we're finally doing, to do the battle with malaria? Malaria is back in other areas, particularly in Southeast Asia, the heart of where so much of al-Qaeda is coming from. Why aren't we going? Why aren't we providing the leadership there? It doesn't, we're talking about, that's a few $100 million. That isn't even in the billions of dollars to be able to do that. Undermine it. Why are they thinking of that way? And we're not kind of thinking of this kind of way. 3 or 4 billion, we're $2.7 trillion budget, and we can't find $3 or $4 billion, and to try and deal with these kinds of things. I think this is an unconventional idea. It's a danger, a real one. And it's unconventional, and we get to deal with it unconventionally. I try to touch on some of the points that President Reagan looked at where we were being challenged frontally. The resourcefulness, the ideas, the imagination, the willingness to think of other kinds of ways of trying to deal with it is sort of something that I think we could use.
All right, let's shift
Just
gears.
give a couple of, good.
As you mentioned in your remarks, we're going to be having a debate here next Thursday of the 10 Republican nominees and a follow-up one in January. And this goes to last Thursday's debate at the Democrats. And what is your personal opinion of the Democratic nominees for president? Yeah. And what is your choice? Is that Senator Biden?
That's Senator Biden. Just in a quick answer, I personally know and have worked just with all of them and have good friends. I've worked very closely with Mrs. Clinton on our health committee. Barack Obama is on our health committee, and I think someone who was the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Law Review, where you could have gone into any law firm in the country, any law firm, and just named your price, to give that up to go back and work as a community organizer in a poor district in Chicago is kind of interesting, says a lot that might not be coming out in the answers to some of the questions, but I think he's a very special. I've worked on the Judiciary Committee with Joe Biden. I have a lot of respect for him. Chris Stott has been one of my real friends and has been the leader in the United States Senate on children's issues, which are big, I think, particularly today. Children of all, with all kinds of the challenges. I don't know, we have Kucinich and Mike Gravel. I admit that Mike Gravel was from Massachusetts originally. Then went to Alaska and he ran up there and got defeated. You might have caught the reason the other night, possibly, why that happened to him. And Dennis I've known just since he was mayor out there. So this is what I think. I'm not supporting, endorsing any of the candidates. I think the real test is who's going to be able to break out and inspire. I think it's the quality that President Reagan had. You know, my brother had as well, and that is he was going to be able to inspire this country, to be able to lead this nation. That you get the sense of it after you watch these debates. Which one was really? It might not, their answers may not be always just where you are, but if they're able to lead, that's going to be an essential aspect to being able to get things on through the Congress. It's going to be essential to restore us in foreign policy. You know, whether it's in Central or South America, or also in the Middle East, and people will get inspired by them. They'll follow it. Whoever's going to be in's going to have difficult challenges, obviously, in terms of the Middle East, and it's really a question of leadership. I probably ought to ask Arnold who he's supporting with the Republican kind of. But I guess it's not my turn. Listen, he's been so nice to come here tonight. You got a great round of applause, well deserved. I wrote it. I must say, you can obviously tell we kid, but what he's trying to do on health care and the environment has been extraordinary. So I give. You're going to tell Maria now? You're going to say something nice to Maria?
Mrs. Reagan and Fred and other members of the board, I never thought I'd be up here talking about the Democratic nominees for president, but we appreciate your thoughts. But you mentioned health care. Senator Kennedy, do you foresee in the next 10 years a single-payer health system?
Well, what I favor is a Medicare for all. That's basically what I have. I've been for health care for 30-odd years. And we're not, we have gone, just let me give you, and I could give you a lot of statistics, but let me give you this, two. One is we have gone from spending $1.3 trillion to $2.2 trillion in the last 6 years, and we have increased the total number of uninsured by 30 million, and we're 47 million now. So all of the indicators are going the wrong way. I mean, all the indicators. I mean, in terms of there isn't a business that can handle it, this is the second point, is 34 cents out of every dollar is administration. You find a businessman in here you brought that 34 cents down to 27 cents. You save $125 billion. If we got information technology, the Rand Corporation say you save $140 billion. I mean, we're spending more money than it needs to be spent, but the question is increasing kinds of pressure on those. And just the last point, it sort of always gets me is that every member of the Senate has complete. We have the best health insurance. Our premium per month is probably $220. I don't think there's a person in here can have it. $220 because the United States Senate. I mean, the idea that we have taken this all for ourselves. It used to be that Americans got so upset when members of the Senate had, I want to say how nice it is to see Mrs. Ribicoff. Abe Ribicoff, you've been introduced. Well, we love you. Her husband was one of the earliest supporters of President Kennedy. All the Kennedys love you. So, but the point is, we really need to come to grips with it. And I think what we've seen now, Massachusetts took some steps. I think Governor Schwarzenegger has outlined a very ambitious program. And you know what we have to have? Politicians have to say, look, we're all going to jump together. The one thing in politics people don't like is if they get ahead, I'm going to go down. No one, I'm not going to go for this because so-and-so is going to get ahead on that part. What they don't understand is everybody can move along together. And that's what the American people want. And if everybody that's sort of what happened in Massachusetts with Romney and DeMacy and a whole group, they all sort of joined hands and they all went together on it, and it's worked. And I think hopefully we can get the states to begin to make big progress in the next 2 years, and then if not, I'd hope that we might be able to take a look at them.
I think
maybe about one or two left, or are they?
Yeah.
Okay.
I kind of feel like Brian Williams after the debate. We could go on forever, and I know that the crowd was, but this will be the last question. I think it's an interesting one. This is, Senator, as a young college student, very involved in politics, I find that many of my peers are apathetic to the problems of the world. Yet, as someone who plans a life in politics, what may I do to start working to solve tomorrow's problems today that my peers are so apathetic about?
Yeah. Well, there's an enormous amount of voluntarism that's out there. And the really good schools and colleges are all helping to channel and funnel that through the nonprofits in getting them kind of involved. What hasn't been as evidence is their interest in political life. I mean, when I was growing up, that was it. This was my brother read all the history, and this was the sort of the crowning opportunity for a career was to serve in public life. So, although my sister Eunice has done the Special Olympics, and as people know, here in California, it's in 144 countries, and probably done as more in terms of affecting people. So you don't have to be elected officials, but you just have to be involved and engaged. I think that's what the success for the country is, getting people involved and engaged. Specifically for that young person, I don't think that, I think getting involved in local campaigns is where it's at. If people come in and they get started in local campaigns, they learn a lot. And they're very close to people, so they really get a sense of the flavor and the texture of what's on people's minds, and that makes a pressure. And they begin to build some friends and alliances in political campaigns that they can, as friends later on, and these people are thinking and talking about the kinds of things that they can do, and the opportunities of moving along ahead are, I think, come very, very quickly after that. I think getting involved in local campaigns makes even a local campaign here, they're all so large, I mean the assembly and all the rest, but getting involved I think is a big deal. Let me just say what an honor it is to be here, and Vicki and I are immensely grateful to all of you for willing to come this evening, and we want to thank again. Nice to see an old friend Merv Griffin, who interviewed my mother. How many years ago, Merv? Boy was the answer to that. 1965, and it was one of her, and she loved that interview. We loved Merv, but boy, this is a mistake. If you get the mic, you never want to give it up, particularly when you got Merv Griffin. But thank you all very much. Thanks, Arnold, for being here. Thank all of you for being here, and thank you, Mrs. Reagan, for the honor of being at President Reagan's library. Thank you. Good. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thanks. Good. Good. Good.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I ask that you please remain seated while Mrs. Reagan and the official party depart, and then the dinner will be in the Air Force One Pavilion. Thank you very much, and thank you, Senator.